Okay.
So tell me a little bit about the campaign so far and from where you're at now.
Well, it's been a great journey. I've spent the past 2.5 years traveling Virginia, telling people about my vision for what I'd like to do as Attorney General, and the reception's been great, and I have racked up endorsements from folks I've worked with for the past 10 years in General Assembly. I've worked across party lines and have 116 sheriffs and Commonwealth attorneys from around Virginia, Democrat, Republican, Independent, supporting me. Fraternal Order of Police, National Federation of Independent Business. The response has been wonderful.
Great. We're going to get into some of the social issues because they're kind of the big hot ticket thing right now going on in the area. We just had another school shooting not long ago where a teacher was killed by a student. Talk a little bit about your feelings on gun control, background checks, that kind of thing, because a lot of Virginians seem to support universal background checks. Do you?
You know, we've got to make sure that we're making sure that our kids are safe, that our schools are safe, and there are a lot of things that we need to do in order to do that. I support our current background check system, our mandatory background checks for all licensed gun dealers. I think that we need to make sure that we are continuing to do a better job, which we've done a lot better job over the course of the past 10 years in making sure that people who shouldn't have guns, who are statutorily barred or are not competent, don't get guns. We need to continue to improve that system, and it's been a system that's been incredibly effective. I think that the great difficulty is sometimes when terrible events, which we've just had too many over the course of the past few years, happen, there's a great tendency to govern on the basis of emotion. And we need to make sure that we're governing by deliberation, by reason. And the things that we're adopting, the things that we're doing, are going to make a real difference in keeping our kids safe, our community safe, our schools safe, and not just making us feel better just because we're doing something. And I've worked with law enforcement to make sure that we really do improve our system, and we need to continue to do that.
You mentioned children and keeping them safe. As far as prosecuting sexual predators and that sort of thing, the Supreme Court recently said they won't even hear the appeal from now Attorney General Ken Cuccinelli about the anti-sodomy law. Is that some legislation that you think should be listened to by the Supreme Court to bring that sort of ban back in here?
Well, that issue's closed. Supreme Court's rejected it. What the General Assembly's got to do is go back and revisit that statute, make sure that it's fixed so that when we prosecute sex offenders, predators, that we are effectively keeping our community safe. There are a lot of child predators who were listed on the sex offender registry whose listings may be imperiled by the outcome of that case. And we've got to make sure that to the extent we can change the law to comply with the precedent of the United States Supreme Court that it set and protect our kids and keep these sex offenders listed, that we do that. So I think the job going forward is one where we ought to cooperate to work with public safety, the outstanding lawyers in the Attorney General's office to see if we can adopt revisions, amendments to the statute to achieve those ends.
Okay. I want to touch a little bit. Human trafficking is something that I read on your website that's on your platform. You're passionate about that. Can you talk a little bit about some legislation you think we need to help combat human trafficking in this area?
You bet. When we talk about protecting kids, kids are facing threats the likes of which we never faced when I was a child. Human trafficking is right up there, and it's really the new front for child predators. It is sex trafficking. Gangs are increasingly finding that they make more money selling children for sex than they are selling drugs. Washington Post and Washingtonian Magazine just did major stories on this happening in Northern Virginia, and some major arrests have been made in Hampton Roads as well. And these gangs are working, recruiting in high schools, middle schools, shopping malls, Facebook, and are recruiting children. The average age of kids involved in sex trafficking, commercial sex, is 13, which means that there are an awful lot of 11 and 12-year-olds. We've got to do a better job equipping law enforcement. I've proposed, among other things, that we create an independent, freestanding human trafficking felony offense that we need in order to make sure that we are that we have an adequate remedy to address those who actually go out there and traffic these kids.
There was a bill that you sponsored where to require women to report miscarriages to the police. Is that something that you still think should happen, or? That was
never something I thought should happen, and that's what my opponent has said, and he knows that's not true. The Winchester Star just did an editorial calling it just patently false, snake oil salesmanship. He knows that it's not true, and I would never impose such a burden, and I'm out there trying to solve tough public safety issues and working with those Commonwealth's attorneys and sheriffs, and they know that I'm reasonable, that I am effective, that I'm working with them, and that's why they're supporting me.
Thank you. Wanted to talk a little bit about the Star Scientific scandal. You know, we had Bob McDonald's numbers seem to take a hit. They're starting to climb a little bit now that that's sort of kind of going away. You talk about ethics reform going on right now. What do you think we need to do to fix that?
Well, you know, the voters in Virginia citizens ought to be able to expect that their elected officials are there to serve them, not to serve themselves. And we've had a crisis of confidence. A lot of voters have had their confidence shaken in our system and in our laws. And I think that we need to take a look at our ethics laws and our gift laws. And I've proposed a ban on gifts in excess of $100 to elected officials in the General Assembly, Governor, Lieutenant Governor, and Attorney General. Also make sure that those bans apply to members of the household, that reporting requirements are increased, and that there's more transparency in the Attorney General's office for procurement. We spend tens of millions of dollars hiring outside counsel every year. People of Virginia ought to be able to look at those relationships and see who we're hiring and what the terms are. These are proposals that I've offered, and I'm here to tell you, no matter what the General Assembly does, I'm going to live by those proposals as Attorney General of Virginia. I think the voters deserve it.
Wanted to touch on a recent poll that came out that says more than half of Americans support the legalization of marijuana. Is that something you support? And if that legislation were to be passed by Virginians, would you abide by that?
You know, look, I'm running for Attorney General of Virginia, and you know, every year when I leave Richmond as a legislator, I go back home and advise clients. In my private practice, I have a firm with 50 employees, and I can't pick and choose the laws that I think are good laws and bad laws. I have to advise clients to comply with the laws that exist. And if General Assembly sometime adopts a change in our drug laws that would legalize marijuana or anything else, you know, I don't have the option of saying, I think that was a bad idea, don't worry about it. Of course we're going to comply with it. I don't agree with it. I think that we need to make sure that we're keeping kids safe, and but you know, attitudes are changing. I think that they'll continue to change, but we need to put our priorities on safe communities, on keeping our kids safe, and my focus is on drug dealers and making sure that we have appropriate penalties for those who would sell drugs to our kids.
Speaking of penalties, capital punishment, Virginia is known as one of the top when it comes to capital punishment. Is the death penalty something that we should continue with as we are now, or is that something we should look at and maybe stepping back from a little bit?
Well, understand this. The Attorney General's office has an important prosecutorial function. It does frontline prosecution in a limited number of cases. It handles the appeals of every criminal prosecution in Virginia. And prosecutors like Harvey Bryant in Virginia Beach, he understands that the job of a prosecutor is not to get convictions, not to get people sentenced to capital sentences, not to put them in prison. It's to pursue justice. And sometimes justice requires you to walk away where the facts don't warrant it. And we need to make sure that our capital punishment statute is being applied fairly. judiciously and with justice as the end. Yes, I do believe that there are truly the worst of the worst out there for whom capital punishment is appropriate. But we need to remain vigilant in making sure that it is applied fairly and only in the appropriate cases. And I won't be afraid to step up and point out cases in which I think it's been unfairly applied.
To go back on Obamacare, which is the big thing right now, with all the glitches in the website, Virginia needing, some people say, to have the health exchange website. There's some states that are doing really well with having their own, Kentucky one of them. Should Virginia adopt this exchange, or do you think the Affordable Care Act is something that we shouldn't have at all?
Well, no secret that we have a problem, a challenge nationally with access to health care. We wouldn't have had the debate over the course of the past 5-6 years over Affordable Care Act and health care reform if we didn't have that challenge. We have to meet the needs of the American people. I happen to believe that the Affordable Care Act was the wrong way to do it. I made no secret of that. I think that it was appropriate to challenge it in the courts, and it was a closely divided opinion that needed to be decided. I think going forward, there are an awful lot of questions when Virginia stepped up and asked the federal government questions about how we would run our exchange, how we would comply. Our exchange would comply with federal law. Federal government did about as good a job in answering our questions as they've done in administering this website. They couldn't answer any of our questions. So we were in a position of having to take a shot in the dark. And Virginia, I think, did the prudent thing of saying, we're going to wait and until the federal government figures out how to get its act together. And I like to think we do a better job in Virginia of running government than they do on the other side of the Potomac. We certainly saw that with shutdown and sequestration. You know, that's not what Virginians expect. We need to do a better job.
I wanted to talk a little bit about the downtown and midtown tunnel project that they have going on. There's a lawsuit right now to stop all of that. They don't want the tolls. They want to stop those tolls, and there's a lot of folks in the General Assembly that are trying really hard to stop this toll on our roads here. How do you feel about that?
You know, I think that we have some, you know, obviously there's few greater challenges in Virginia than trying to figure out how we're going to meet our transportation needs. We really do need public-private partnerships and the opportunity to address some of our transportation needs in that way. But by the same token, we've got to do a better job of taking into consideration factors like affordability, hardship, alternatives that may exist. And I think that as we look at this challenge, I think we need to maybe look at changing the law to make sure that the Commonwealth Transportation Board and parties to these partnerships take into consideration those factors, because I don't believe that the same deal would have been made on this particular project had some of those considerations been considered. As Attorney General, my job is to defend the law, and I'm going to do that whether I agree with it or not. There are important public policy issues there that the General Assembly is going to continue to grapple with. I've been there for the past few years and trying to figure out how we're going to make these round trips affordable to people is a great challenge, and I think it's something that the General Assembly is going to continue to wrestle with over the next couple of years.
You supported the legislation to have abortion clinics have the same regulations as hospitals. Can you talk about why you felt that abortion clinics needed to have those regulations and not those of a clinic with a doctor in it, just the doctor in it, private practice?
You know, I am somebody who believes that, you know, if a woman makes a decision to access one of these clinics, that we need to make sure that the standards are such that her health and safety are protected. And applying the same standards across the board, I think, are important. The real question, though, is looking forward as Attorney General, are we going to comply with the law? And I'm going to make sure that we have a system that is compliant with the law that as it stands. And look, in our federal constitutional framework, there's decisions and there are rules that I don't necessarily agree with, but I can't pick and choose as Attorney General which of those that I want to comply with. We're going to operate within that framework.
Do you support the gay marriage ban that we have right now, and should that maybe be something that Virginians have another crack at and maybe overturning it?
Well, sure. My opponent and I in this race for Attorney General both voted for the marriage amendment, along with 1.6 million Virginians who voted for it. And I know that opinions are evolving, and who knows what's going to happen in the future. It's been challenged in a lawsuit. You suggest that Virginians may have another crack at it, and quite frankly, there are two ways that amendment ought to be resolved. I mean, if we're going to revisit it, it ought to be decided by a court deciding on the merits, or by the people of Virginia who cast their votes and decide whether we're going to keep that amendment or not. As Attorney General, again, I can't pick and choose. My job will be to defend the constitutionality of that amendment. The Supreme Court's made it very clear that there's an open, unresolved question, and I'm going to defend the law and let the courts make that decision, as opposed to substituting my judgment and walking away. And my opponent has refused to say whether he'd defend that statute or not. I think it's important for somebody to defend it and for us to follow the established process if we're going to revisit it, and not to have an Attorney General who's going to substitute his judgment and walk away and have it fail by default.
This election will be the first for a lot of convicted felons to actually be able to vote in this election. Is that something that you support? Do you think convicted felons have reformed and should be allowed to vote in any election?
You know, I am somebody who's guided by my faith, and in my spiritual life, grace is a very important component. I believe that we should receive grace, and I believe that convicted felons ought to have a pathway to restoration of their rights, and I'm delighted that we are doing better in restoring the rights of convicted felons in Virginia, and we ought to have a system that's available to get to that point. So yeah, I think that we've made good progress, and we need to continue to do a better job of making sure that there's that pathway available.